The Ecology of Protists. After a few days of rain, you notice a small spot of yellow slime at the base of a stand of tall grass. You mark its position. A few days later, you come back and it has grown and moved away from the mark. Is it an animal, a fungus, a strange plant? The correct answer is none of the above. It is a protist called a slime mold. What is the ecological significance of a photosynthetic protist? The position of the photosynthetic protist at the base of a food chain makes much of the diversity of aquatic life possible. Organisms commonly called algae actually belong to many different groups. Some, the cyanobacteria, and prokaryotes, some, like green algae, belong to the plant kingdom, and some are protists. Photosynthetic protists include many phytoplankton species and the red and brown algae, as well as euglenas and dinoflagellates. These organisms share an autotrophic lifestyle marked by the ability to use the energy from light to make a carbohydrate food source. Not all photosynthetic protists are similar to plants. In fact, the red algae are the most similar to plants. Many other photosynthetic protists, however, are more like non-photosynthetic protists. In some cases, certain species within a group do not have chloroplasts. In other cases, endosymbiosis have a chloroplast in some species, but not in other species that look the same. The domain is diverse. Photosynthetic protists play major ecological roles. The position of the photosynthetic protists at the base of the food chain make much of the diversity of aquatic life possible. Part of phytoplankton are protists. Photosynthetic protists make up large portions of phytoplankton, the small, free-floating photosynthetic organisms found near the surface of oceans and lakes. About half of the Earth's photosynthesis is carried out by phytoplankton. Phytoplankton provide a direct source of nourishment for organisms as diverse as shrimp and baleen whales. Phytoplankton are an indirect source of nourishment for humans. When you eat tuna fish, you are eating fish that fed on smaller fish, that fed on still smaller fish, that fed on still smaller animals, that fed on photosynthetic protists. Coral reefs, which are found in warm ocean waters throughout the world, provide food and shelter to large number of fish and other organisms. Protist algae, known as zooxanthellae, provide most of the coral's energy needs by photosynthesis. By nourishing coral animals, these algae help maintain the equilibrium of the coral ecosystem. Coralline red algae also help to provide calcium carbonate to stabilize growing coral reefs. The largest known protist is a giant kelp, a brown algae that can grow more than 60 meters in length. The kelp forests provide shelter for many marine species. Kelp is also a source of food for sea urchins. Many protists grow rapidly in regions where sewage is discharged, where they play a vital role in recycling waste materials. When the amount of waste is excessive, however, populations of protists like euglena can grow to enormous numbers and create an algal bloom, which can disrupt ecosystem homeostasis by consuming much of the oxygen in the water. An algal bloom in a pond or lake can deplete nutrients from the water, and the decomposition of dead protists can rob water of its oxygen, causing fish and invertebrates to die. Algal blooms of marine protists, called dinoflagellates, create what is known as red tide. The buildup of toxins produced by these protists can poison fish and shellfish. How do heterotrophic protists obtain food? Some heterotrophic protists engulf and digest their food, while others live by absorbing molecules from the environment. Amoebas can capture and digest their food surrounding a cell or particle and then taking it inside themselves to form a food vacuole. A food vacuole is a small cavity in the cytoplasm that temporarily stores food. Once inside the cell, the material is digested and the nutrients are passed along to the rest of the cell. Indigestible waste material remain inside the vacuole until the vacuole releases them outside the cell. Paramecium and other ciliates use their cilia to sweep food particles into the gullet. Their cilia, little hairs on the outside. The gullet is an indentation in one side of the organism. The particles are trapped in the gullet and forced into food vacuoles that form at its base. So a vacuole will form here when it closes off. Here's the macronucleus, micronucleus, contractile vacuole. And then here is the entrance to the gullet, the oral groove. And here's the exhaust, the anal pore. The food vacuoles pinch off into the cytoplasm and fuse with the lysosomes, which contain digestive enzymes. Lysosomes are not labeled here, but let's say it's this one and this one, the digestive enzymes. Waste materials are emptied into the environment when the food vacuoles fuse to the region of the cell membrane called the anal pore. A slime mold is a heterotrophic protist that thrives on decaying organic material. Slime molds are found in places that are damp and rich in organic matter. On the floor of a forest or a backyard compost pile, for example, slime molds play key roles in recycling nutrients in the ecosystem. At one stage in their life cycle, slime molds exist as a collection of individual amoeba-like cells. Eventually, these aggregate to form a large structure known as a plasmoidium, which can continue to move, a feeding plasmoidium and a mature plasmoidium. The plasmoidium eventually develop sporangia, in which meiosis produces haploid spores to continue the cycle. Young sporangium, and here's a mature sporangium, and it produces spores. Some protists survive by absorbing molecules that other organisms have released to the environment. Water molds, for example, grow on dead and decaying plants and animals, absorbing food molecules through the cellulose cell wall and cell membranes. This underwater dead tree is covered with the common water mold, Saprolegnia. What type of symbiotic relationship involved protists? Many protists are involved in mutualistic symbiosis, in which they and their hosts both benefit. For example, red algae maintain a mutualistic relationship with the animals of the coral reef, which could not survive without the protist's help. Trichonympha is another example of a mutualistic protist. Trichonympha is a flagellated protist that lives within the digestive systems of termites and makes it possible for the insects to digest food. Termites themselves do not have enzymes to break down the cellulose in wood. Trichonympha and other organisms in the termite's gut manufacture an enzyme called cellulase that breaks the chemical bonds in cellulose, making it possible for termites to digest wood. Parasitic protists are responsible for some of the world's most deadly diseases, including several kinds of debilitating intestinal diseases, African sleeping sickness, and malaria. Waterborne protists are found in streams, lakes, and oceans. Water supplies contaminated with animal and human feces can spread protist parasites, causing serious and sometimes deadly outbreaks of intestinal disease. For example, the flagellated protist Giardia causes severe diarrhea and digestive system problems. Even crystal clear streams may be contaminated with Giardia that produces tough cysts that can be killed only by boiling water thoroughly and by adding iodine to the water. Entamoeba causes a disease known as amoebic dysentery. The amoebas live in the intestines where they absorb food from the host. They also attack the wall of the intestine itself, destroying parts of it, and causing severe bleeding. Cryptosporidium is resistant to the chlorine compound often used to sanitize drinking water, and therefore poses a special threat to public water systems. In 2008, an outbreak in Utah sickened more than 2,000 people. The flagellated protist trypanosoma cause African sleeping sickness. Trypanosomes are spread from person to person by the bite of a tsetse fly. Trypanosomes destroy blood cells and infect other tissues, including nerve cells. Severe damage to the nervous system causes some individuals to lose consciousness and lapse into a deep and sometimes fatal sleep. Control of the tsetse fly and the protist pathogens that spread is a major goal of health workers in Africa. Malaria is one of the world's most serious infectious diseases. Malaria is caused by Plasmodium, a spore-forming protist carried by the female Anopheles mosquito. Plasmodium requires two hosts to complete its life cycle, an Anopheles mosquito and a human. A female Anopheles mosquito bites a human infected with malaria and picks up Plasmodium gametes. Fertilization occurs in the mosquito's digestive tract, and Plasmodium sporozoites develop. The infected mosquito bites another human, transmitting the sporozoites through its saliva to the human bloodstream. The Plasmodium sporozoites. Inside the human body, the sporozoites infect the liver cells, developing into merozoites, and then infect the red blood cells. Merozoites and into the red blood cells. Infected red blood cells burst, causing malaria symptoms in the human host. Some of the released merozoites form gametes, and the cycle continues.